The biggest stewardship decisions of your life are not the decisions about how much you will give. The biggest stewardship decisions of your life will be the decisions you make about how much you tie up so that you cannot give it.
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. I'm David Pick. I'm glad you could be with us today. And Colin, I know most of us don't enjoy sermons about giving because we're just thinking, so how much do I have to give? But it's great to hear that reframed. It's not how much money you're going to give, it's how much are you going to tie up.
And it comes right out of the scripture, because one of the issues that Jesus raises with the Pharisees was about an obscure idea in those times called corban, which meant that you could tie some resources up, and then you said, well, they're tied up, so they're not available for any other use, and therefore it was a form of selfishness. But you know, this goes right to the heart of some of the economic issues that are afflicting millions of people's lives in our country today. The decision to overreach so that money is tied up and pressures are brought on life that are very, very difficult to get out of. What if decisions were made that the commitments I make are to be within the range of what Christ has trusted to me, so that I'm a wise steward of everything that he has given, and not someone who puts myself in a position where I'm always going to be behind because I've made commitments I should never have taken on. It's amazing how the Bible speaks so practically into these issues. And this is one place, an often neglected place in the Bible, that speaks very practically into not just the issues of how much we give, but the issues of how much we tie up so that we're no longer able to give.
So let's get right into that today. We're in Mark chapter 7. As we begin the message, Jesus cleanses the hearts of his people. Here's Colin.
Today we're going to see something else very wonderful indeed. And it's right there in our title, that Jesus cleanses the hearts of his people. We're going to see why we need to be cleansed, and how it is that Jesus Christ can do that for us. Now, it's worth just remembering that the Bible uses two very important words, and they have some distinction in their meaning. The Bible talks about forgiveness, but it also talks about cleansing. We need to be forgiven so that we can be at peace with God. We need to be cleansed so that we can live in the presence of God. Forgiveness, if I can just put it for those who like to have a sort of theological frame in their minds, just a couple of sentences here. Forgiveness really properly belongs to the realm of justification. That is, coming to be at peace with God. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That's where forgiveness belongs. But cleansing belongs to the realm of sanctification. The Bible also says, without holiness, no one can see the Lord. So think of it this way: forgiveness is essentially about restoring your relationship with God. Cleansing is about restoring your life before God. And these are the two great promises of the gospel. They are ours in Jesus Christ, never the one without the other. Now, of course, we hear a great deal about forgiveness, but not so much, I think, about cleansing, and therefore this is a very important subject that is before us today. Now, I hope you won't find it to be too much information, but truth is, I was just thinking about this as one does sometimes in the shower one morning earlier this week. I didn't do all of the sermon preparation in the shower, just so that you know that. And while I was there, I picked up this shampoo bottle. I didn't say whose it was, I just picked it up. And this is what it says: herbal essences, and they've coined a new word. I like this word: degunkify. You turn it around, and just ahead of the instructions on how to use this particular substance, which I always find very helpful that they put that on the back of the bottle, it explains the meaning of this new word that they have coined: degunkify. Lose the leftover gunk and ick of gels and of sprays. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get up in the morning and kind of stagger out of bed and kind of bleary-eyed head towards the shower, I know that I need to be degunkified. That is exactly how I feel, and apparently this stuff will de-gunkify your hair. But the question before us this morning is, what will de-gunkify your heart? That's the question. What will de-gunkify your life? And I hope you have the Bible open in front of you, because we're going to see three things from Mark's Gospel and chapter 7. And the first of them is simply this, that if your heart, if your life is to be cleansed, de-gunkified, then you need to begin by measuring your life by the right standard. And that really seems to me to be the main theme of verses 1 through 13, and I hope you have the Bible open so that we can look at it together. You've got to start, if you're to find cleansing of heart, by measuring your life by the right standard. Now let's jump in at verse 1. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem, and we've met these characters before, they gathered around Jesus. Now straight away we know that these folks had already rejected the Lord Jesus. Remember from Mark in chapter 3 and verse 6, we saw that the Pharisees were plotting how to kill Jesus. That's pretty clear rejection. That's chapter 3 and verse 6, the Pharisees. And the other group here are the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem. Now, we've met these characters before as well, haven't we? Remember in chapter 3 and in verse 22, they were the ones who came down. We pictured them with the clipboards making an official assessment of the ministry of Jesus, and their official report was that he's doing the work of the devil. That's chapter 3 and verse 22. Now, these are pretty clear expressions of rejection. What I want you to notice is that those who had rejected God's Son were incredibly religious. And you see that in verse 3 and in verse 4. They were scrupulous. These folks who had so clearly rejected Jesus about ceremonial washing of their hands in verse 3, and of cups, and of pitchers, and of kettles in verse 4. And if you have opportunity to travel around the world, just watch for this. This is a universal phenomenon. It goes across every continent. It skips across cultures. This rites of pouring water over different parts of the body, pouring water over things that you use, cups and dishes and utensils and so forth, as a kind of ritual washing. And the Pharisees were scrupulous, the teachers of the law, scrupulous about doing these things, because they felt that these ritual washings of hands and feet and cups and kettles would in some way preserve purity before God. And so they were scrupulous about these things. Now I want you to notice what Jesus says to these folks in verse 8. It is absolutely astonishing. Jesus says to them, "You have let go of the commands of God. You're just holding to the traditions of men." Now, it's honestly hard for us really to feel the shock value of these words. These folks were the custodians of values within the community at the time. They were the role models of moral behavior. If you were a parent with younger children, you would point to the Pharisees and say, these are the kind of guys that you want to be like. That's how people thought of those who were moral leaders within the community. And Jesus comes to these exemplary characters as they were perceived to be, and Jesus says to them, you have let go of the commandments of God. Kind of speechless. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus gives a specific example. See, God is absolutely just. He never gives kind of vague general indictments against people. On the last day, when God brings charges against all men and women, they will be very specific. No one will ever be in hell and not know why. And Jesus here gives an example of that. He said, let's get specific. Let's give an example of how you have let go of the commandments of God. And he chooses just one example, though I want you to notice in verse 13 that he says this is just one of many possible examples. He says, you do many things like this. Let's look at the example then, one of many. Verse 10, Jesus quotes the fifth commandment. Moses said, honor your father and your mother. But our Lord says, verse 11, you say that if a man says to his father and mother, whatever help you might have received from me is corban, that is, a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and his mother. Now, very simply, the Pharisees had this program in which you could declare money or possessions to be corban. And what that meant was that if you declared something to be corban, it meant that that possession, house or whatever, or these particular funds were restricted and could not be used for certain purposes. In other words, this program was a way of tying up money so that it was not available for other use. Now, there are many ways in which we do that today. A good example would be like a pension fund. You have a designated use for this particular fund. It is still your money, and at some point you will use and access that money. But it is set aside for particular use. You don't touch it through most of your life, or at least there are penalties that will be incurred if you do. Now, you see how this program worked. If you had declared assets to be corban, and then someone in your family came along with a particular need, then you could honestly say, I'd love to be able to help you, but I just don't have the resources available to do it. And your father and mother might say, well, wait a minute, you're a millionaire, son, aren't you? And then you would say, oh, yeah, but all of that is corban, you see. It's all in restricted access, it's for particular use, and it's not available, therefore, for this particular purpose of helping you. That's basically how the program worked. And in the corban program, you could choose what the restrictions were. So, for example, if someone was saying, I can see that my mother and father are going to have extensive financial needs, and the last thing I want is for it to come out of my pocket. What you did, you see, was you declared assets corban against them. So there was a restriction. Whatever else it could be used for, it couldn't be used in relation to them. And in that way, the money was protected from being drained and so forth and so on. That's basically how the system worked. And so in verse 11, Jesus describes this situation in which, let's suppose a man declares his property corban to his parents. And you could imagine how this might happen. Perhaps there was a big argument in the family, and the son has fallen out with the father, and he says, well, I'm not going to use a penny of my money to help him. And so he declares his assets corban to his father. But then let's suppose one day there's a change of heart, and there's a wonderful reconciliation. Son is reconciled to the father, and he really feels, because his father's in quite a desperate situation, that he wants to be able to use these resources to help his dad. So he comes to the Pharisees, and he wants to release the restriction, you see. It's kind of like, although this is the other way around, it's kind of like what happens with a will, isn't it? Father and son have a great argument, and father says, well, he's not going to get his filthy hands on one penny of my money, so off he goes to the lawyer and cuts the boy out the will, you see. And then in the goodness of God, 5 years later, there's a wonderful reconciliation. And the two hearts are softened towards each other. And the dad says, I want to change my will. I'm going to put him back in. I'm so thankful for the change that's taken place. So what does he do? He goes off to the lawyer and changes the will. Now, you see, it's kind of like that situation. Here it's the other way around. The son has declared things corban against his parents. He now goes back to the Pharisees and says that he wants to be able to use these resources to be able to help his parents. And here's the problem. The Pharisees didn't allow you to do that. Once you had declared an asset corban, it could not be changed. Now, of course, if you think about it in the way that systems work, some people probably found that very useful. Because the fact that the Pharisees protected that corban vow could never be changed kind of took the pressure off anyone feeling that perhaps they ought to change it. That's how systems work, isn't it? By the way, this is a good example of Christ holding accountable men and women who create and uphold systems that are fundamentally unjust. This was the Pharisees' program, and it mitigated, it contradicted hearts of compassion. And Jesus holds them accountable for what they had created and for the effects of it. Now, very simply then, the corban program was a way of tying up money so that it was no longer available to meet a particular or even an obvious need. Money that could have been used to assist someone God had placed very close to a person was restricted, and because it was restricted, it was thereby protected so that it could not be released, and a son could say to his father, I'd really love to help you, but I really can't, because you see, it's all tied up.
That was then. What about now? We'll come back in just a moment and find out. You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Jesus Cleanses the Hearts of His People. If you've missed any of the messages in this series, which is called The Gospel According to Jesus, you can always catch up or go back and listen again online. Come to our website, openthebible.org.uk, and either listen to the programs online or follow the link to a podcast version of Pastor Colin's messages. Those are on all the major podcast sites, and you can easily find them by following the link on our website. Maybe you consider yourself a skeptic. You haven't exactly accepted Jesus, but you haven't rejected him either. You have questions. What would Jesus say to you? Well, we can find out in the Bible. Jesus took time to talk to skeptics, and even better, he offered them a route to faith. That's the subject of Pastor Colin's new booklet, What Jesus Says to Skeptics. This month, we're offering 5 copies of that booklet to anyone who's able to begin a new direct debit to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more, or a one-time gift of £50. More details later on in the broadcast, so I hope you'll stay with us. Back to the message now. Here's Colin.
Now, at first glance, you read through Mark chapter 7, you think this is light years away from where we are today. The more I've looked at it, the more I've become absolutely convicted that it raises some really important questions for us, and they're issues that every one of us in the sanctuary faces. The biggest stewardship decisions of your life are not the decisions about how much you will give. The biggest stewardship decisions of your life will be the decisions you make about how much you tie up so that you cannot give it. And these are questions, honestly, that all of us face and on which we have to make judgments. How much of what you have should you tie up in a house? How much should you tie up in your pension? How much should you tie up in a venture, or in travel, or in sports, or in interests, or in pleasures? These are discipleship decisions. Because what you tie up, you cannot release. So the great decisions that we're making are not kind of belated decisions about, should I give this or this? The real decisions are being made when we are determining what we tie up, because what we tie up, we cannot release. And as you move through life, if having money is more important to you than meeting needs, this is what will happen. You will find ways of tying up more and more money so that you have less available to meet the needs of the very people that God has placed around you, because it's all protected and restricted and corbaned and tied up. It was nothing to do with the message today, but I just so happened to have a conversation this week with someone in the congregation here. And we were talking about whether he would apply for another job and so forth and so on, and the various issues. And And then we got on to talk about where he was living, and he said, you know, we're at the stage where the natural thing for my wife and I and for our kids would be for us to move up to a larger house. But he said, honestly, we don't need to do that. And we've talked about it, and we've decided we're not going to do that. And for him, this was a discipleship decision that was motivated by the desire to use the larger amounts of money that were now becoming available as he was getting well down in paying off his mortgage, a desire to use what was becoming available for ministry rather than tying up more and more and more as the years move forward in his life. Now, let me say this very clearly. We must be very careful that we do not judge our brother or our sister in this matter. And if you're immediately thinking about someone else who you think is tied up too much, then you're seeing a speck of sawdust in someone else's life. There's very probably, in Jesus' words, a plank of wood in your own. Okay. But we must be rigorous in examining ourselves on the really big stewardship decisions, which are the decisions about how much you tie up. Because what you tie up, you cannot release. By the way, this is one of the biggest reasons and motivations for getting out of debt. The last thing in the world you want in your life is for your resources to be corbaned on a credit card, right? And you honor God, if you're in that position, by getting out of that as quickly as you possibly can. And you honor God by staying out of that as vigorously as you possibly can, so that what God has trusted to you may be wisely stewarded, and you may be in a position to use what has been trusted to you as expressions of loving God with all your heart and loving your neighbor as much as you love yourself.
A great reminder there from Pastor Colin that if your heart is going to be cleansed, you must measure it by the right standard. Our message is, Jesus cleanses the hearts of his people. It's from a wider series called The Gospel According to Jesus, and if you've ever missed any of the series, don't forget you can catch up or go back and listen again online at our website, openthebible.org.uk. Also on our website and available as a podcast is Open the Bible Daily, and that's our series of short 2 to 3 minute daily reflections based on Pastor Colin's teaching and read in the UK by Sue McLeish. Open the Bible is supported by our listeners, and it's your financial support that keep Pastor Colin's teaching on the air. So thank you if you already give to support Open the Bible. If you don't already give, but that's something you'd like to do, this month we have an offer for you. If you're able to set up a new direct debit to the work of Open the Bible this month in the amount of £5 per month or more, or a one-off gift of £50 or more, we'd love to say thank you by sending you 5 copies of Pastor Colin's new booklet, What Jesus Says to Skeptics. That's 1 copy for you to read and 4 to give away to your friends and family. Colin, there may be someone who's listening today who is a skeptic when it comes to the Christian faith. How would this booklet be helpful to them?
Well, I think the first thing is that a skeptic might think, well, because I don't yet believe, Jesus Christ is not going to have very much time for me. But what we find in the Gospels is that Jesus cared very, very deeply about skeptics. He spent time with people who had honest questions and engaged with them at a very deep level. And he offered them a pathway to faith. So if you or someone you know is a skeptic, this is an opportunity for you to hear what Jesus has to say to you.
Well, we'd love to send you 5 copies of Pastor Colin's booklet, What Jesus Says to Skeptics, as our way of saying thank you for your financial support. You can find out more, including full terms and conditions, and give online at openthebible.org.uk. For Open the Bible and Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll be able to join us again next time. What are the greatest challenges to Christians living a holy life? Find out why it's not Hollywood or the internet. That's next time on Open the Bible.